just what is God's will? Or what is will? In our verse this morning from Romans 12, second verse, it tells us to be transformed by the renewing of your mind so that you may prove what the will of God is. And we hear, we listen. People, preachers will say that, again, God has a purpose for you. He has a plan for you. And to know His will. Well, what do they mean by His will? I have asked that question to several other preachers. And the answer that I've gotten really hasn't been satisfactory to me. It just doesn't, not saying that they're wrong or right or what, but it just doesn't. In a sense, I can't make heads or tails out of it. The answer that they give in so many words will be that God's will, and notice that it is singular word, will, is both perfect and permissive. Louis Schaeffer, in his systematic theology, defines it that the will of God, or will actually, is that faculty in a rational, conscious being, that means the human, by which he has power to choose a course of action and continue in it. Well, okay. He goes on to say then that God's will is either directive or perfect. Words are interchangeable there. Or it is permissive. So when I use the word or, to me at least, that means that there has to be two wills. So I would say, what would be the correct question then? What are the wills of God for us, for you? So that's why I come up against a stone wall. I don't understand the meaning. And I've asked for clarification in conversations with some preachers, and I get the same answer. And I'm still lost in its meaning. So I looked it up in the secular dictionary. I went to Merriam-Webster and I looked up will. And of course, it defines a legal document, saying that it is a declaration of a person's wishes regarding the disposal of his or her property or the estate after they die. We all know what a will is. And even there, you can get confused because I've been asked, do you have a living will? A will is a will. But apart from that, as a noun, then the dictionary says it is a desire a wish, an inclination, something desired, a request, and here it is, a command. So I'll go with that. A will is a command. Maybe. Jonathan Edwards, if you recall, I tried to find the message I gave. It's been a couple of years. On his deathbed, he was laying in an unconscious state, and I guess the people around him were murmuring, talking. They were wondering what the loss of Edwards was going to mean to the church. He was an irreplaceable individual. When all of a sudden, he uttered the words, "Trust in God, and you need not fear." So I went back, I underlined the word, trust in God, and you need not fear. Okay. Now let me jump to Vice President Pence's book, So Help Me God, which, by the way, I haven't finished it yet, but it is a very, very good read. And he writes concerning the January 6th incident that when the Secret Service informed him that they had to move out of the Senate chamber because the protesters had already went by the House chamber doing what they were doing, and they wanted to get him out. And he told them that the Secret Service detail, that they would hold their position until the Capitol was secure. He went on to say that because of the peace and resolve that was formed during his upbringing by his family and his faith, he felt no fear. There's that word again. So he said he wasn't going to leave his post. He was not afraid. Then he added in there that I have often told my children that the safest place to be in the world is in the center of the will of God. So here we have Jonathan Edwards, a little over 200 years ago, saying, trust in God, and you need not fear. And you have the Vice President saying, have God, be in the center of God's will, and you need not fear. Well, that's good, but did that satisfy me? Unfortunately, being how I am, no, it didn't. So I'm going to throw a wrench in the cog here. Which will is Mike referring to? Or is Edwards referring to? They both say will of God. But is it the perfect or directive will, or the permissive will that everybody talks about? You know, if we're sitting there talking about the will of God, our two wills, plural. So I went back to the theological answer, or the definition given by Louis Schaeffer. God's directive or perfect will is that which includes all of his doctrines, his decrees, his commandments. And his permissive will is when he allows man his choice of that which could be seen as maybe second best, or what he thinks might be the best, man think would be the best thing to do, and it will include evil. That may satisfy some, but I'm still there scratching my head. So, what is it that I am looking for? Well, I think the jury is probably still out. So I tried this thought. You're a parent, and you set down a set of rules, do's and don'ts, house rules, and you expect your children to follow them. Or a business has a standard operating procedures, things that you can do, you can't do, etc. Well, for the parent, let's go with that. That is your will. That is your desire. That is your request. And if they don't follow the rules, they break them or they disobey them, what do? Well, the kids have to suffer the consequences of that. Maybe you ground them. If they're teenagers, you take their keys away, or they can't watch Saturday morning cartoons. Put them on timeout. But if you have a permissive will, then I take that to mean that you are willing to let them disobey the rules. And again, in my way of thinking, if that's the case, then why are you even going to punish them for breaking the rules? I don't know if that makes any sense to anyone sitting here or anyone listening, but that's just my point of view, my way of thinking. But if God does have a permissive will, then why is it written in Hebrews 12, verses 4 through 11? And let me just read to, I got it written down here, through to verse 7. My son, do not take the Lord's discipline lightly or lose heart when you are reproved by him. For the Lord disciplines the one he loves and punishes every son he receives. Endure suffering as discipline. God is dealing with you as sons. For what son is there that a father does not discipline? Now, you can read on to verse 11, and you can have it all in context. Well, when we use the term, the will of God, we need to know that, yes, there are two clear and different meanings for the one verse. Not that there are two different wills, just meanings for the one term. Earlier I said that most classify God as having two wills: directive, perfect, or permissive. Well, I kept searching, and fortunately, it happened to be someone I think is a great theologian. Came across John Piper. And he gave a clear answer to my question. Well, I didn't ask him, I just happened to be reading it. So instead of calling or saying directive or perfect will, let's use the term sovereign. And that is that which always comes to pass without fail. And then what we refer to as permissive will actually give it the meaning that it is his command to do what is right, which is often that part which is disobeyed and therefore does not come to pass. So Scripture uses the term the will of God, one term, but it uses it both ways. So I think that when his command, which is often disobeyed, then is what is meant by most as being a permissive will, which maybe permissive isn't really a good word or a good term to use for the term the will of God, or to add it in. But then we could be getting into semantics, and because Paul tells Timothy in his second letter to avoid all kinds of, as an NIV says, stupid arguments, which lead to nothing but arguments amongst his children. We'll leave it there. So Mike Pence wrote, and he said that the safest place to be in the world is in the center of the will of God. So which meaning is he referring to? The sovereign or the command of God? What is the sovereign will? Well, it's what God decrees. Is that's always going to come to pass no matter what. What God decrees happens, including all the bad things in the world. God is going to work it all out for the good. He knows it, though we may not know it. In Matthew 26, verse 39, Jesus cries out to his Father, "If it is possible, let this cup pass from me. But nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will." So what is he meaning, you will? Your will be done? He means his sovereign plan. Something which is, something that is going to happen. It's going to come to pass. Jesus is going to die. So in his human nature, in which we know that he was 100% human and at the same time 100% God, in that human nature he is saying, paraphrasing, I don't really relish the thought of nails going through my hands. So if maybe you could tweak the plan just a little bit, adjust it some, that would please my flesh, because I'm just an ordinary person and really don't like to have my hands and my feet pierced with nails, or be whipped and have my skin torn apart by the whips. But he says, your will be done. Meaning, I know that you have a plan. Do your plan. So this will of God is God's sovereign plan which he always executes. It was God's plan for salvation, something that he had planned before the beginning. If we look at Acts 4, verse 27 and 28, this may shed a little light in the dark places concerning this issue. The church is praying in wonder to the sovereign God that had just ordained the death of his son. Here we go. For truly in this city there were gathered together against your holy servant Jesus, whom you anointed, both Herod and Pilate. Let's repeat that. Your holy servant, they were gathered against your holy servant Jesus, whom you anointed, both Herod and Pilate, along with the Gentiles and the peoples of Israel, to do whatever your hand, your purpose, predestined to occur. So it's telling us that Herod did exactly what God ordained, predestined, willed that would take place. Pilate did what God ordained, what he predestined, what he willed to take place. And the shouting crowds saying, "Crucify, crucify him." They did what God ordained, what he predestined to take place, along with the soldiers and the Gentile soldiers who drove the nails. They too did what God had predestined and ordained to take place. So the sovereign will of God was accomplished there at 9 o'clock on a Friday morning. So the expediency of Pilate and all the mockery of Herod, the hatred of the mob that was stirred up by the Pharisees, all that was planned. By whom? By the sovereign will of God. So his sovereign will, the sovereign part of his will, is something that will always come to pass. And it can and will many times include sin. 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 17. He writes, "It is better if God should will it so, that you suffer for doing what is right, rather than for doing what is wrong." You're at work, wherever that may be. A policy is issued, something is added to the SOP, and it's something that is wrong. It's sinful. Now, it would involve you, it would involve all the other employees that take part in this in doing wrong, sinning. Now, you know that if you say something, you're going to be in big trouble. You could even lose your job. So you end up doing good. You choose to do what is good. And what happens? You end up speaking the truth. So you get disciplined and or fired. I've been there. Some of you may have been there already. But I also think about the nurses, the doctors, healthcare workers, at various hospitals, not so much here in Savannah, but you hear about it throughout the states. There are pro-life volunteers here in Savannah, associated with the Catholic Archdiocese, Life is Sacred, or the pro-life group of St. Anne's Catholic Church in Richmond Hill. There is the Christ Church Anglican. There's the Thrive organization. They're mocked. So applied the verse. It is better to suffer for doing good, if that should be God's will. And on the other end, there's those that do not want to do God's will, or they remain silent. One well-known church, along with another, I'll just leave them unnamed for now, would not respond to the repeated requests by the Savannah Morning News. This is back in May of last year, for any comments concerning the Roe versus Wade and on the abortion issues. But there was one minister, preacher, who serves as chaplain for the Savannah Police Department, who happens to be president of an interdenominational ministerial alliance. He did give his view on abortion, but yet he split between biblical principles and what he calls a person's legal right to choose. That's a cop-out. That kind of a comment. I don't know how many faith leaders are like that. I will name Raphael Warnock, who happens to be a senator, minister, Baptist minister, who says he's biblically sound on being pro-abortion, the right to choose. These people want to be fine, splitting the line. They want to be good with God, and they want to be good with Satan so that they don't receive any mockery or persecution or whatever. But recall Elijah, when he stood there at Mount Carmel and he reproved the people. Or Joshua, when he taught them, how long are you going to serve or be of a split mind? Serve two things. Are you going to serve God or are you going to serve Baal? Joshua telling the people, are you going to serve God or the gods that your fathers worshipped in Egypt? That's in Joshua 24. And for Elijah, 1 Kings 18. Well, at any rate, you refused to do wrong at your work, wherever, and you spoke out. You were doing good by refusing and speaking out against what was going on, right? God could have hindered you from being fired, or maybe even talked about and ridiculed and looked at in a bad light. But God did not do it. So this verse tells us that the way He governs and runs the world, it may be God's will that you suffer for doing good, which also involves someone sinning against you. Well, the best statement concerning all of this, regarding the will of God, you can find it in Ephesians, the first chapter, verse 11. Where Paul writes that we have obtained an inheritance, having been predestined according to His purpose, from Him who works all things after the counsel of His will. So that's all things. He does everything according to His own counsel. Now, we used to be kind of smart aleck when we were younger. We'd be asked a question. It says, well, who told you could do that? And you'd say, well, me, myself, and I. You go after your own counsel. Well, God does all things according to His counsel. If you ask Him, He would say, me, myself, and I decided. And His will extends even to the smallest things in creation, things that we think are insignificant of His existence. We'll have a closing hymn later, and it's just interesting how that was selected by Gene. And we look at Matthew 6, verse 26. Look at the birds of the air, that they do not sow, nor reap, nor gather into barns, yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not worth much more than they are? It's His will. How about Matthew 10? Let's go to verse 29. Are not 2 sparrows sold for a cent? Yet not one of them will fall to the ground apart from your Father. He wills it, they'll fall. He wills against it, they will not fall. Go back even further to Proverbs. Let's go to verse 16, chapter 16, verse 9. The mind of man plans his way, but the Lord directs his path. You can plan all you want, but the Lord will tell you which way to go on that plan. Proverbs 16, down to the 33rd verse. The lot is cast into the lap, but every decision is from the Lord. Now, I didn't flip the coin I didn't roll the dice when I was deciding whether to move from Panama back here to the U.S. And as far as I was concerned, I made the decision. And the only one that was consulted was Iris. And that, she may say, is questionable, whether it was consulted or not. But as you read concerning God's will, His sovereign will, according to Proverbs 16:9 and 16:33, the decision was totally, completely His. Now, there's a lot more, because it wasn't all wine and roses after the move. But that's another story. All throughout the Bible, the will of God, the will of God, the term, the will of God, means what He does will happen. God is sovereign, and He alone decides what will happen. I'm going to conclude right here. Next week, Brother Dean will be preaching. So on March 5, we'll take up the command, or the will of command, or the meaning of command in the will of God.
Discouraged, why should the shadows come? Why should my heart be lonely? I long for heaven and home, when Jesus is my portion, my constant friend is He. His eye is on the sparrow, and I know He watches me. His eye is on the sparrow, and I know He watches me. I sing because I'm happy. I sing because I'm free. For His eye is on the sparrow, and I know He watches me. Let not your heart be troubled. His tender word I hear, and resting on His goodness, I lose my doubts and fears. Though by the path He leadeth, but one step forward may see. His eye is on the sparrow, and I know He watches me. His eye is on the sparrow, and I know He watches me. I sing because I'm happy. I sing because I'm free. For His eye is on the sparrow, and I know He watches me. For His eye is on the sparrow, and I know He watches me.